Dawn broke reluctantly over the Norman coastline on June 6, 1944, revealing a sight that would forever haunt those who witnessed it. The horizon, once empty, save for the rhythmic dance of waves against the shore, now bore the silhouettes of over 5,000 Allied vessels, stretching as far as the eye could see. For the German soldiers manning the Atlantic Wall fortifications, this was the moment their commanders had warned about, yet many had ceased to believe would ever come. Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in military history, had begun, and those first German defenders were about to face a tempest of steel and determination unlike anything seen before in warfare. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now let's get to the story. The German soldiers stationed along the Atlantic Wall represented a complex tapestry of experience, motivation, and capability. They were not the unified elite force often portrayed in simplified historical accounts. By June 1944, the German military machine was stretched across multiple fronts, with its best units and equipment primarily deployed to the Eastern Front, where the desperate struggle against the Soviet Union consumed resources at an alarming rate. What remained to defend Hitler's Fortress Europe was a patchwork force that would soon face the full might of the Western Allies. The Atlantic Wall itself, despite propaganda touting it as an impenetrable barrier, was an incomplete defense system. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring had famously boasted that no enemy would ever set foot on German-held territory, yet the reality on the ground told a different story. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, appointed to inspect and strengthen these coastal defenses in late 1943, had been horrified by what he found. The absence of any serious defense against a large-scale landing is simply frightening, he wrote in his reports to Berlin. Despite his urgent efforts to improve the situation in the months leading up to June 1944, time and resources had proven insufficient. For most German soldiers awaiting that fateful morning, the war had already lasted far longer than expected. Many veterans had survived campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia, while others were recent conscripts or transfers from other military branches. Among them were Volksdeutsche, ethnic Germans from occupied territories, Eastern Europeans from conquered lands who had either volunteered or been pressed into service, and even some older reservists who had been called up as the manpower crisis deepened. The 709th Infantry Division, responsible for much of the Cotentin Peninsula, including Utah Beach, contained a significant number of Osttruppen, former Soviet prisoners of war who had chosen to fight for Germany rather than face starvation in POW camps. The 302nd Infantry Division, positioned unknowingly in the path of the American forces targeting Omaha Beach, was relatively better equipped and trained, having been formed from the remnants of units that had survived the Eastern Front. Yet even this division had many green soldiers who had never faced combat. The 716th Infantry Division, covering the British and Canadian landing zones, was largely composed of older soldiers, deemed unfit for the Russian front, supplemented by conscripted Poles and other Eastern Europeans. Only the 21st Panzer Division and later the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend represented truly elite formations, and they were positioned inland as mobile reserves. In the pre-dawn hours of June 6th, these diverse forces found themselves in various states of readiness. Some bunkers and gun emplacements were fully manned, while others operated on skeleton crews. The weather had been poor for days, and many German commanders believed no landing would be attempted under such conditions. General Wilhelm Richter of the 716th Division had actually allowed many of his men to participate in anti-invasion exercises further inland. Field Marshal Rommel himself had left for Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday and to meet with Hitler, confident that the Allied invasion was at least several days away due to the unfavorable weather conditions. This miscalculation proved catastrophic as the Allied deception plan, Operation Bodyguard, had successfully convinced the German High Command that the main invasion would come at the Pas de Calais rather than Normandy. Consequently, when the first reports of airborne landings began to filter through German communication networks around midnight, there was initial confusion and disbelief. Were these merely diversionary attacks? Should reserves be committed immediately? Or would that play into Allied hands by drawing forces away from the real landing zone? For Oberfeldwebel, Sergeant First Class, Kurt Warnecke of the 726th Infantry Regiment, the night began with the distant drone of aircraft engines. From his bunker overlooking what would later be designated as Gold Beach, he observed the darkened sky seemingly filled with Allied planes. His unit had been on heightened alert due to weather forecasts predicting a brief improvement in conditions, but nothing had prepared them for the scale of what was unfolding. "We heard the aircraft long before we saw them," he later recalled in a post-war interview. "Then came the paratroopers, like dark ghosts against the night sky. We knew then that this was not just another raid." Further east, near Sword Beach, Unteroffizier, Corporal Friedrich Müller of the 736th Infantry Regiment was awakened by the sound of naval gunfire. His company had been placed on rotation, with half the men resting while the others maintained watch. The rotation had been a concession to the weeks of false alarms and Allied feints that had left the defenders exhausted. "The first shells landed near our ammunition depot," Miller wrote in his diary, recovered after the war. "The entire bunker shook as if struck by an earthquake. We scrambled to our positions, many still pulling on boots and equipment. The lieutenant was shouting orders, but his voice was lost in the thunder of explosions. The initial Allied bombardment, both from air and sea, created a hellish environment for the defenders. The psychological impact of sustained artillery fire is difficult to overstate. The constant noise, the vibration of the earth, the smell of explosives, and the knowledge that, at any moment, a direct hit could end one's life." German accounts from survivors frequently mention the feeling of helplessness as they huddled in reinforced positions, unable to respond effectively to the overwhelming firepower directed against them. Yet the bombardment, while terrifying, was not as effective as Allied planners had hoped. Many German bunkers and gun emplacements survived intact due to their reinforced concrete construction. The naval gunfire, though impressive in volume, often fell short of key defensive positions due to concerns about hitting the approaching landing craft. The pre-invasion aerial bombardment suffered from poor visibility, with many bombs landing harmlessly inland. This meant that as the first landing craft approached the beaches, they faced defensive positions that were damaged but still operational, manned by defenders who were shaken but still capable of resistance. At Omaha Beach, where American forces would soon face the stiffest resistance, Hauptmann Captain Helmut Lang of the 352nd Infantry Division had used the hours of bombardment to refine his defensive preparations. Unlike some of his counterparts who had been caught by surprise, Lang had maintained strict discipline among his men, keeping them at combat readiness despite weeks of false alarms. His sector contained several Widerstandsnester, resistance nests, fortified positions designed to provide interlocking fields of fire across the beach. "We could see little through the smoke and dust," he recorded in an official report filed days later when he became a prisoner of war, "but we knew they would come with the rising tide. My orders were clear. Not a single American was to leave the beach alive." As the sun began to rise around 5:30 a.m., German observers reported a stunning sight. The sea itself seemed to be advancing toward the shore. Through the lifting mist, the first landing craft became visible, approaching in tight formations. For many German soldiers, this was the moment when the abstract concept of invasion became a shocking reality. They were vastly outnumbered, facing what appeared to be the combined might of the Western powers. The response varied dramatically across the 5 landing beaches. At Utah Beach, where American forces landed, the German resistance was relatively light. A combination of factors, the effective suppression of some defensive positions by naval fire, the miscalculation that had left the beach less heavily defended, and the flooding of inland areas that channeled the attackers into more easily defensible zones, created a complex tactical situation. For Feldwebel, Sergeant Otto Schmidt of the 709th Infantry Division, the Americans seemed to materialize from the sea mist without warning. They were on the beach before we could properly target them, he told his interrogators after being captured. Our machine guns opened fire, but there were so many of them, and they moved with such determination. The experience at Omaha Beach was dramatically different. Here, the 352nd Infantry Division, unknown to Allied intelligence, had recently reinforced the sector. From their elevated positions in the bluffs overlooking the beach, German gunners had excellent fields of fire. The first waves of American troops faced devastating fire from machine guns, mortars, and artillery. The German defenders, watching through binoculars and gun sights, witnessed scenes of carnage as landing craft were hit before reaching shore, and soldiers fell in the water and on the beach. Gefreiter, Private First Class, Werner Kortenhaus, a machine gunner with the 726th Grenadier Regiment at Omaha, described the grim effectiveness of their prepared positions. We had trained for this moment, calculated the ranges, and prepared interlocking fields of fire that covered every meter of the beach. When the ramps of the landing craft dropped, we opened fire. The Americans had nowhere to hide. The tide was rising, pushing them toward our guns. Many never made it past the water's edge. Kortenhaus would be captured by mid-morning, as American forces gradually gained footholds and worked their way up the bluffs through gaps in the German defenses. The German experience at Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches, where British and Canadian forces landed, followed a similar pattern of initial defensive success, followed by gradual loss of position as the sheer volume of Allied forces made its impact. At Gold Beach, elements of the 726th Regiment found their carefully prepared defensive positions compromised by effective naval gunfire. Lieutenant Karl Werner's company had lost communication with neighboring units due to severed telephone lines, forcing each position to fight in isolation. We could not coordinate our fire or receive new orders, Werner reported. Each bunker became its own fortress, fighting alone until ammunition ran out or the position was overwhelmed. For many German defenders, the sight of specialized Allied vehicles, the funnies developed by British forces, came as a shock. These included tanks modified with flails to clear mines, bridging equipment to cross obstacles, and flame-throwing capabilities. Against these armored innovations, the standard anti-tank weapons proved inadequate. At Juno Beach, where Canadian forces landed, Oberleutnant First Lieutenant Hans Miller watched in dismay as his carefully laid minefields were systematically cleared. We had been told our obstacles and mines would turn the beach into a graveyard for tanks, he later recalled. Instead, they came with machines we had never seen before, clearing paths through our defenses as if they were brushing aside cobwebs. The Allied air superiority added another dimension to the German defenders' challenges. Any movement of reserves during daylight hours invited attack from roaming fighter bombers. Major Heinrich Weber, attempting to reposition elements of the 21st Panzer Division toward the beaches, found his column repeatedly attacked from the air. We could not move without being seen, he reported. Every vehicle that broke cover was immediately attacked. We were fighting with our hands tied. As the morning progressed, the German command structure began to fragment. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander in the west, and General Leo Freiherr Geyer von Schweppenburg, commanding Panzer Group West, recognized the gravity of the situation but were constrained by Hitler's standing orders. No significant reserves could be committed without the Führer's personal approval, and Hitler was asleep at his Berghof retreat in Bavaria. His staff, aware of his often erratic sleeping habits, were reluctant to wake him with news that might trigger an unpredictable response. This delay proved critical. By the time Hitler was briefed and reserves were authorized to move, precious hours had been lost. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, composed largely of fanatically loyal Hitler Youth members, led by experienced officers, was among the units ordered to counterattack. They would not reach the battlefield until the following day, by which time the Allies had significantly strengthened their beachheads. For the German soldiers on the front line, the experience of D-Day was one of progressive isolation and overwhelming force. As Allied troops pushed inland, many defensive positions were bypassed, leaving their occupants cut off. Some chose to surrender, while others fought to the last bullet, inspired by both military discipline and ideological indoctrination. The bunkers and trenches that had been their homes for months became their last stands or their prisons. Obergefreiter, Senior Private First Class Ernst Schroeder, of the 352nd Infantry Division, found himself in such a situation at Omaha Beach. His concrete bunker, designed to house a 75 mm gun covering the beach approaches, had survived the initial bombardment with the gun intact. His crew inflicted heavy casualties on the first waves of American infantry. But as the Americans adapted, sending small teams to outflank the position, Schroeder's situation became untenable. "We fired until the barrel was glowing red," he recounted to American intelligence officers after his capture. "Then the Americans were behind us, throwing grenades through the rear entrance. The lieutenant was dead. 2 men were badly wounded. We had no choice but to surrender." By midday, the pattern of the invasion had become clear to the German High Command, though confusion still reigned at many local levels. The Allied deception operations continued to tie down significant German forces in the Pas-de-Calais region, with Hitler himself still convinced that the Normandy landings might be a diversion. This strategic paralysis at the highest level translated into fragmented, uncoordinated responses on the ground. At Utah Beach, American forces had pushed approximately 2 miles inland by noon, though their progress was slowed by the flooded terrain. At Omaha, after the brutal struggle of the morning, American troops had secured positions on the bluffs overlooking the beach and were beginning to move inland against diminishing resistance as German ammunition ran low. The British and Canadian forces at Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches had made similar progress, though they had not reached their ambitious Day 1 objectives of capturing Caen and Bayeux. For the German defenders who had survived the morning's onslaught, the afternoon brought the realization that they were fighting a losing battle. Many had expected reinforcements that never materialized or had lost contact with their command structures. Ammunition was running low, casualties were mounting, and the seemingly endless flow of Allied men and materials from the sea demonstrated the futility of continued resistance in isolated positions. Feldwebel Johann Voss of the 726th Grenadier Regiment described the psychological impact. "We had been told for years that the Allies would never dare to invade, that our defenses were impregnable. Then suddenly they were here in overwhelming numbers, with equipment we could not match. Some men fought with fanatical courage, others simply surrendered when their positions became hopeless." The difference often came down to individual character and how deeply one believed in the cause. As night fell on June 6, the situation for the German defenders had deteriorated dramatically. The 5 Allied beachheads were firmly established, and though they had not yet linked up as planned, the momentum clearly favored the invaders. The German units facing the beaches had suffered catastrophic casualties, with many companies reduced to a fraction of their fighting strength. Those who had survived were often cut off from supply and communication lines, forced to fight isolated actions without coordination or support. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armored formation to launch a significant counterattack on the first day, had briefly reached the coast between Sword and Juno Beaches late in the afternoon. For a brief moment, it seemed they might split the Allied beachhead. But lacking infantry support and under constant attack from the air, they were forced to withdraw as darkness approached, having lost a significant portion of their tanks. As stars appeared over Normandy, the remaining German defenders faced a night of uncertainty and dread. Many used the darkness to attempt to regroup, falling back to more defensible positions or trying to link up with friendly forces. Others, cut off and surrounded, prepared for a final stand at dawn. Radio operators worked desperately to reestablish contact with higher command, seeking orders and reporting their increasingly dire situations. In his command bunker near Caen, General Richter of the 716th Infantry Division assessed the day's catastrophic losses. Nearly 80% of his division's combat strength had been destroyed or captured. The defensive line he had been ordered to hold at all costs no longer existed as a coherent entity. "We must prepare for the worst," he told his staff officers. "Tomorrow they will consolidate their beachheads and push inland with even greater strength. Our only hope lies in reinforcements arriving quickly enough to contain them." But those reinforcements faced their own challenges. The 12th SS Panzer Division, moving toward the battlefield, was repeatedly delayed by air attacks and fuel shortages. Other units received contradictory orders as the German command structure struggled to develop a coherent response to the invasion. The rigid hierarchy of the Nazi military system, with its emphasis on awaiting orders from above rather than showing initiative, hampered effective reaction to the rapidly evolving situation. For individual German soldiers who had survived the day, the night of June 6-7 brought little rest. Many used the darkness to improve their positions, evacuate wounded comrades, or replenish ammunition where possible. Others simply waited, weapons ready for the dawn that would bring renewed attack. The psychological burden was immense, the certainty that the following day would bring even greater Allied strength against their diminished numbers. What many German defenders did not yet fully comprehend was the historic significance of what they had witnessed. The Atlantic Wall, touted by propaganda as impregnable, had been breached in a single day. The Western Allies, long dismissed by Nazi leadership as lacking the will for serious ground combat, had demonstrated both technical sophistication and fighting determination. The strategic initiative on the Western Front had irrevocably shifted. Oberst Colonel Friedrich August Schack, commanding the 272nd Infantry Division's elements in the invasion area, captured this realization in his war diary. "Today we have witnessed the beginning of the end. The Anglo-Americans have established themselves on continental soil with overwhelming materiel superiority. Our forces are fragmented, communications disrupted. Unless a miracle occurs, we cannot drive them back into the sea." As June 6th came to a close, the survivors of the Atlantic Wall's defensive forces prepared for another day of desperate combat. What none could know was that D-Day represented not just a tactical defeat, but the beginning of the final chapter of the Third Reich. The Allied foothold in Normandy would grow into a massive force that would ultimately drive toward the German homeland itself. For the German soldiers who had faced the first waves on those blood-soaked beaches, the horrors of D-Day were just the beginning of the long retreat that would end in total defeat less than a year later. Yet even as the strategic situation deteriorated, many German units continued to fight with remarkable tenacity and tactical skill. Their training, discipline, and in many cases ideological commitment sustained resistance long after objective military logic might have dictated surrender. The coming battle for Normandy would demonstrate that breaking through the Atlantic Wall was only the first step in a brutal campaign that would cost both sides dearly. As midnight approached on that pivotal day, German leaders from the front lines to Berlin grappled with a new reality. The second front that Stalin had long demanded was now a fact. Germany would henceforth be caught in a vice between East and West, its military resources stretched beyond sustainable limits. Some commanders already recognized that June 6, 1944, would be remembered as the day the tide of war turned definitively against the Third Reich. For the surviving German soldiers who had faced the initial onslaught, exhaustion finally brought a measure of respite as they collapsed into whatever shelter they could find. Many used these quiet hours to write final letters home, sensing they might not survive the coming days. Others cleaned weapons, distributed the ammunition of fallen comrades, and prepared defensive positions for the battle they knew would resume with the dawn. Gefreiter Paul Müller of the 916th Infantry Regiment wrote in his pocket diary, "I do not know if I will see another sunset. Today I have witnessed things no man should see. The sea itself brought forth an army greater than anything in history. We fought as we were trained to do, but they kept coming, wave after wave. Tomorrow they will come again, stronger than before. God have mercy on us all." Müller would be captured 2 days later, his diary eventually finding its way to Allied intelligence analysts, seeking to understand the German experience of D-Day. As the clock ticked past midnight and into June 7th, the survivors of the Atlantic Wall defenses faced an uncertain future. Their world had changed irrevocably in the span of a single day. The invaders had established a foothold that would never be relinquished. The horrors they had witnessed, both inflicted and endured, would remain with them for the rest of their lives, and for many the worst was yet to come. Dawn on June 7th revealed the full extent of the transformation that had occurred along the Norman coastline. Where the Atlantic Wall had stood as a seemingly impenetrable barrier just 24 hours earlier, now Allied forces were firmly established on French soil. For the surviving German defenders, the morning light exposed a battlefield littered with the wreckage of war, disabled vehicles, shattered concrete fortifications, and the bodies of fallen comrades. More ominously, it revealed the massive buildup occurring on the beaches as the Allies poured men and materials ashore in volumes that dwarfed anything the Wehrmacht could muster in response. Lieutenant Carl Schmidt of the 352nd Infantry Division observed the scene from a damaged observation post above Omaha Beach. The Americans had transformed the beach overnight, he later recalled in a POW debriefing, where yesterday there had been only scattered groups fighting their way inland. Now there were organized columns, supply depots, field hospitals, and a constant flow of vehicles moving up from the shore. We counted over 30 tanks in 1 hour. Our remaining artillery could not even begin to target such numbers effectively. The German soldiers who had survived the initial invasion now faced a harsh new reality. Many found themselves in isolated pockets, cut off from command structures and supply lines. Their carefully prepared defensive positions designed to repel attackers from the sea now faced the wrong direction as Allied forces pushed inland. What had been frontline fortifications just hours before were now behind enemy lines, surrounded and vulnerable to attack from multiple directions. Feldwebel Heinrich Müller's squad from the 726th Grenadier Regiment found itself in precisely this situation near Gold Beach. Having withdrawn from their coastal bunker as British forces overwhelmed adjacent positions, they spent the night in a farmhouse 2 kilometers inland. "We awoke to find British patrols on all sides," Müller wrote in a statement after his capture. "Our radio was damaged, ammunition was low, and we had 3 wounded men who could not be moved. The Feldwebel put it to a vote, fight to the end or surrender. We were soldiers, not fanatics. We chose to live." Not all units made the same choice. Ideological indoctrination, especially among SS formations and some of the younger soldiers raised entirely under Nazi education, produced instances of fanatical resistance. A platoon from the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, arriving near Sword Beach on the morning of June 7th, immediately launched a counterattack against numerically superior Canadian forces, fighting until virtually annihilated. Their commander, Untersturmführer, 2nd Lieutenant Erich Hahn, embodied the regime's expectations, reportedly telling his teenage soldiers, "We fight until victory or death. There is no middle ground. Remember your oath to the Führer." Such dedication, while militarily significant in creating tactical challenges for Allied advances, could not alter the strategic reality. The German defensive system in Normandy had been irreparably fractured. Field Marshal Rommel, returning from Germany on the afternoon of June 6th, assessed the situation with characteristic realism. "The war cannot be won from the Western Front," he reportedly told his staff officers. "Our task now is to prevent total collapse and gain time for a political solution." Such defeatist thinking, had it reached Hitler's ears, would have been deemed treasonous. But among the professional military leadership, similar conclusions were being privately reached across the front. For the German soldiers still trying to mount an effective defense, the second day of the invasion brought even greater challenges than the first. Allied air superiority made daylight movement nearly suicidal. Oberleutnant Werner Kleist of the 21st Panzer Division described the experience. To move a tank column even 1 kilometer required elaborate preparation. We would wait for cloud cover, disperse vehicles with at least 50 meters between each, and position lookouts to warn of approaching aircraft. Even with these precautions, we rarely completed a movement without losses. The Jabos, fighter-bombers, seemed to materialize from nowhere, striking without warning. This air dominance affected every aspect of the German response. Reinforcements moved primarily at night, often arriving exhausted after long marches through unfamiliar terrain. Supply convoys faced similar challenges, resulting in critical shortages of ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies at the front. Artillery units had to camouflage their positions extensively and limit firing to avoid revealing their locations to Allied spotters who would call in devastating counter-battery fire or airstrikes. The psychological impact of fighting under such conditions was immense. Veterans of the Eastern Front, accustomed to the brutal but more conventional warfare against Soviet forces, found the Western Allies' technological advantages and material wealth shocking. "In Russia, we fought man against man, tank against tank," wrote Hauptmann Friedrich Becker of the 352nd Infantry Division. "Here, we fight against an industrial colossus. They have a machine for everything, specialized tanks to clear mines, tanks that can swim, portable bridges, and weapons we have never seen before. And their supply seems limitless. They discard equipment we would carefully salvage and repair." This disparity in resources became increasingly evident as the battle progressed. By the afternoon of June 7th, all 5 Allied beachheads had been linked into a continuous front, and the focus shifted to expanding the perimeter and pushing inland toward key objectives. The German defenders, now fighting a desperate holding action, implemented a strategy of defense in depth using the hedgerow country of Normandy, the bocage, to maximum advantage. The bocage landscape consisted of small fields surrounded by ancient earthen banks topped with hedges, creating natural defensive positions that channeled attackers into predictable paths. In this environment, even relatively small German units could inflict significant casualties on numerically superior Allied forces. Feldwebel Anton Schmidt's 8-man squad from the 352nd Infantry Division held a critical road junction near Colleville for nearly 6 hours against repeated American attacks, withdrawing only when outflanked and nearly out of ammunition. "The Americans had to pay for every meter," Schmidt later told his captors. "We had perfect fields of fire down the lanes, and they could not bring their tanks through the hedgerows. If we had had enough ammunition and men, they might never have broken through." Such local tactical successes, however, could not compensate for the broader strategic failure. By the evening of June 7th, Allied forces had penetrated up to 10 kilometers inland in some sectors. More critically, the beachheads were secure enough to begin landing heavy equipment and supplies in volumes that would soon make the invasion irreversible. German reconnaissance reported seeing artificial harbors, the famous Mulberry Harbors, being towed into position, a clear indication that the Allies intended a sustained campaign rather than a raid or diversion. For the German High Command, the situation demanded difficult decisions. Field Marshal von Rundstedt advocated for a strategic withdrawal to more defensible positions along the Seine River, arguing that trying to contain the Allied beachhead with the forces available was impossible. Such a withdrawal would have abandoned much of northern France, but might have established a more sustainable defensive line. Hitler categorically rejected this approach, issuing his infamous Stand Fast order, requiring all units to hold their positions regardless of tactical situation. This rigid approach led to predictable results. German units, forbidden to conduct elastic defense with planned withdrawals to secondary positions, found themselves fighting to the last man in untenable situations. The result was the systematic destruction of Germany's irreplaceable Western reserves with minimal strategic benefit. Veteran officers recognized the folly of this approach, but few dared to countermand Hitler's explicit orders. At the small unit level, this translated into scenarios of increasing desperation. Lieutenant Karl Weber commanded a reduced company of the 915th Grenadier Regiment defending a manor house near Carentan. Allied forces had bypassed his position during their advance, leaving Weber's men surrounded, but still able to interdict a secondary road. "We received orders by radio to hold at all costs," Weber recorded in his final report, recovered after the position was overrun. No reinforcement or resupply was possible. "We held for 3 days, repelling 7 distinct attacks. When ammunition ran critically low, I sent the 18 wounded men out under a white flag. The remaining 32 of us prepared for the final stand." Such sacrifices, while testifying to the discipline and courage of the German soldier, served little strategic purpose. The Allied advance continued inexorably, if more slowly than planners had hoped. By June 10th, over 326,000 men, 54,000 vehicles, and 104,000 tons of supplies had been landed. Against such numbers, the remaining German defenders could only delay, not prevent, the Allied breakout from the beachhead. For the German soldiers captured during these battles, the experience of becoming prisoners of war brought its own traumas and revelations. Many had been indoctrinated to expect mistreatment or execution, particularly those who had served on the Eastern Front, where prisoner treatment on both sides was often brutal. The generally correct treatment they received from Western Allied forces came as a surprise. "The Americans gave us cigarettes and coffee," reported Gefreiter Hans Müller of the 726th Grenadier Regiment. "They treated our wounded alongside their own. It made me question what we had been told about our enemies." As the battle for Normandy evolved from the desperate coastal defense into a protracted campaign of attrition, the experiences of the German soldiers who had faced the initial invasion waves became part of military history. Many did not survive to see the ultimate outcome. The 352nd Infantry Division, which had borne the brunt of the American assault at Omaha Beach, lost over 70% of its combat strength within the first week. The 716th Infantry Division, facing British and Canadian forces, effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting unit by mid-June. For those who survived those critical first days, the war would continue through the Norman countryside, the breakout at St. Lo, the Falaise Pocket, and for some all the way back to the German homeland. Each stage brought its own horrors and challenges, but few would forget the shock of June 6, 1944, when the sea itself seemed to disgorge an endless army that would ultimately bring the Third Reich to its knees. The Allied invasion forces quickly established a formidable presence that fundamentally altered the balance of power. By June 12th, despite falling short of some planned objectives like capturing Caen, the Allies had landed approximately 500,000 men, creating a lodgment that would prove impossible to dislodge. German forces, now fighting under the dual constraints of material shortages and Hitler's no-withdrawal orders, found themselves making incremental concessions of territory while suffering unsustainable casualties. The experience of Normandy permanently changed the German military's perception of their Western opponents. Prior to D-Day, many German officers and soldiers, particularly veterans of the Eastern Front, had dismissed British and American forces as lacking the will for sustained ground combat. This dismissive attitude, reinforced by Nazi propaganda, was shattered by the determination shown during the landings and subsequent battles. Hauptmann Ludwig Werner, a company commander in the 21st Panzer Division, reflected this changed perspective in a letter home, recovered after his death in the Falaise pocket. These are not the same British we drove into the sea at Dunkirk. They fight with a cold professionalism that is difficult to counter. And the Americans, once they gained their footing, showed a stubbornness we did not expect. They learned quickly from their mistakes. This recognition came too late to alter the war's outcome. The Western Allies, now firmly established in France, would push steadily eastward, eventually meeting Soviet forces advancing from the east. The German army, caught between these two fronts and increasingly deprived of fuel, equipment, and trained replacements, could only delay the inevitable. For the individual German soldiers who experienced D-Day and survived, the memory of that day would remain vivid throughout their lives. Many in post-war interviews and memoirs described it as the moment they realized Germany could not win the war. Obergefreiter Wilhelm Schmidt, who had manned a machine gun position at Juno Beach until captured on June 7th, summarized this sentiment. When we saw what came out of those landing craft, not just men, but tanks, bulldozers, all manner of vehicles and equipment, I knew then that all the Führer's speeches about final victory were empty words. No force on earth could have stopped such power once it was unleashed. The military impact of D-Day extended far beyond the beaches of Normandy. The establishment of the Second Front forced Hitler to divert precious resources from the Eastern Front, where Soviet summer offensives were gaining momentum. It prevented the development of new weapon systems like jet aircraft and ballistic missiles from reaching operational numbers that might have influenced the war's outcome. And perhaps most significantly, it demonstrated to the German people that Allied victory was not merely possible, but inevitable. Within the German military leadership, the successful Allied landing accelerated existing divisions. The July 20, 1944, attempt to assassinate Hitler, though unsuccessful, revealed the extent to which many senior officers had concluded that continuing the war served no purpose beyond prolonging suffering. Field Marshal Rommel himself, who had worked tirelessly to strengthen the Atlantic Wall defenses, became peripherally associated with the plot, leading to his forced suicide in October 1944. As Allied forces pushed deeper into France, the German defenders who had survived the initial landings found themselves fighting a series of increasingly desperate rearguard actions. Many units were gradually reduced to battle groups of company size or smaller, combining remnants of different formations under whoever remained in command. Equipment losses far outpaced replacements, forcing improvisation and adaptation. Oberstleutnant Lieutenant Colonel Heinrich Keller described commanding such a group near St. Lo in late June. My battalion consisted of parts of 3 different infantry regiments, a few assault guns, and whatever stragglers we could incorporate. We had no standard organization, limited communications, and supply was sporadic at best. Yet these men continued to fight effectively, often against overwhelming odds. The determination shown by such units, despite their circumstances, was rooted in a complex mixture of factors: professional military discipline, unit cohesion, and the bond between soldiers fighting together remained powerful motivators even as the strategic situation deteriorated. For some, especially younger soldiers indoctrinated under the Nazi regime, ideological commitment sustained resistance long after military logic might have dictated surrender. Others fought on primarily to protect comrades or to survive, with little thought for the broader conflict. Hauptmann Werner Kleist of the 12th SS Panzer Division observed this complexity in his command. Some of my men still believed victory was possible, that some secret weapon would turn the tide. Others fought because they feared the consequences of defeat for themselves, their families, and Germany. The veterans, mostly transferred from the Eastern Front, fought because that is what soldiers do. They had no illusions about the outcome, but maintained professional pride in their skills and unit. By late July, the battle for Normandy was reaching its climax. Operation Cobra, the American breakout near St. Lo, shattered the already stretched German defensive line. Armored columns pushed rapidly eastward and then turned north, threatening to encircle the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army in what would become known as the Falaise Pocket. Hitler's continued insistence on holding ground rather than conducting a fighting withdrawal ensured that many of Germany's best remaining units would be trapped in this encirclement. For the soldiers caught in the Falaise Pocket, the final days of the Normandy campaign brought horror beyond anything experienced on the beaches. Allied air power controlled the skies absolutely, striking at any visible movement. Artillery fire from multiple directions created zones of devastation where nothing could survive. And as the pocket shrank, units were compressed into ever smaller areas, losing cohesion and effectiveness. Unteroffizier Karl Weber, commanding a platoon of the 352nd Infantry Division, described the scene. The roads were clogged with destroyed vehicles and the bodies of men and horses. We moved only at night, trying to find a way through the Allied lines. By day we hid in woods or ditches as the aircraft circled overhead. There was no food, little water, and ammunition had to be scavenged from the dead. Men who had fought bravely for weeks now threw away their weapons and tried to surrender, only to be cut down by artillery that made no distinction between those fighting and those attempting to yield. When the Falaise Pocket was finally closed on August 21, 1944, approximately 50,000 German soldiers had been captured and another 10,000 killed. Allied estimates suggested that only about 20,000 Germans escaped the encirclement. Among those trapped and killed were many of the survivors who had faced the initial D-Day landings, completing the destruction of Germany's Western Field Army. The experience of the German soldiers who defended against the D-Day landings offers important perspectives on one of history's pivotal battles. Their accounts reveal both the strengths and weaknesses of the German military system in its final phase, the tactical proficiency and individual courage that made them formidable opponents even in disadvantageous circumstances, alongside the strategic rigidity and ideological distortions that ultimately ensured their defeat. For those who survived the beaches, the hedgerows, and even the Falaise Pocket, the war continued. Some fought in the brief defense of Paris or along the Seine. Others retreated to the German border, helping to man the defenses of the Siegfried Line, or West Wall. A few would fight all the way to Berlin. But for many, the experience of facing the Allied invasion force on June 6, 1944, remained the defining moment of their military service, the day when the abstract concept of defeat became a concrete reality. The fates of some of the individuals mentioned in this account provide a microcosm of the German military experience following D-Day. Oberfeldwebel Kurt Warnecke, who had observed the first airborne landings from his bunker overlooking Gold Beach, was captured on June 7th and spent the remainder of the war in a POW camp in England, returning to Germany in 1946. Hauptmann Helmut Lange of the 352nd Infantry Division, who had prepared the defenses at Omaha Beach, was also captured and provided valuable intelligence to Allied interrogators about German defensive preparations. Gefreiter Werner Kortenhaus, the machine gunner who had witnessed the slaughter of American troops coming ashore at Omaha, survived the war, but suffered from what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. In a 1978 interview, he reflected, "For years after the war, I could not sleep without seeing those men falling as they left their landing craft. We were soldiers doing our duty, but such memories do not fade. The Americans were brave men, facing our guns with incredible courage. In another time, we might have been friends, not enemies." Feldwebel Johann Voss, of the 726th Grenadier Regiment, was killed during the fighting retreat from the beaches, his body never formally identified. His family received the standard notification that he was missing in action, one of thousands of such notices that brought grief to German homes. Oberst Friedrich August Schack, who had predicted the beginning of the end in his war diary, was captured during the Falaise encirclement and spent the remainder of the war as a POW, later providing valuable insights to military historians studying the campaign. The experiences of these men and thousands like them constitute an essential part of understanding D-Day, not as a one-sided triumph, but as a human struggle in which courage, fear, determination, and suffering were present on both sides. The German defenders, regardless of their cause's morality, demonstrated many of the same martial virtues as their Allied opponents: discipline, tactical skill, unit cohesion, and personal bravery. That these qualities were ultimately insufficient against the combined might of the Western Allies offers important lessons about the nature of modern warfare, where industrial capacity and technological advantage often prove decisive. In the decades following the war, many former German defenders of the Atlantic Wall contributed to historical understanding through interviews, memoirs, and participation in veterans' events. Some even formed friendships with their former adversaries, finding common ground in their shared experiences as soldiers. These reconciliations, alongside the broader European project of peaceful integration, represent perhaps the most positive legacy to emerge from the horror of that June day in 1944. For the modern visitor to Normandy's beaches, German defensive positions remain visible: concrete bunkers, gun emplacements, and obstacles that have survived decades of weather and tourism. These silent remnants offer tangible connections to the past, allowing us to better comprehend the battlefield as experienced by both attackers and defenders. Archaeological work continues to uncover artifacts and enhance our understanding of the battle's details, while oral histories preserve the human dimension that official records often fail to capture. The strategic significance of the German failure to repel the D-Day landings cannot be overstated. While the war would continue for almost another year, the establishment of the Western Front in France meant that Germany would face a two-front war it could not possibly win. The resources devoted to opposing the Allied advance, men, machines, fuel, and ammunition, could not be used on the Eastern Front, accelerating the collapse there as well. From June 6, 1944 onward, the Third Reich was fighting for time rather than victory. For the soldiers of the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS who faced the initial onslaught on the Norman beaches, the experience represented a unique moment in military history, the point at which the theoretical possibility of defeat became an undeniable reality. Their testimony, preserved in interrogation reports, diaries, letters, and post-war interviews, provides an invaluable perspective on one of history's decisive battles. Through their eyes, we gain a more complete understanding of what happened on those beaches, not just a triumphant liberation, but a human catastrophe in which courage and suffering were abundant on both sides. The horror faced by German soldiers against D-Day's first wave was not just the physical destruction of combat, though that was considerable. It was also the psychological shock of confronting an enemy whose resources seemed limitless, whose technological advantages were overwhelming, and whose determination matched or exceeded their own. It was the realization that years of propaganda about Allied weakness and German invincibility had been fatally misleading, and for many it was the beginning of a painful reassessment of the cause for which they had fought and the regime they had served. In the final analysis, the German defense of Normandy represented both a tactical achievement and a strategic failure. Individual units often fought with remarkable effectiveness given their circumstances, inflicting significant casualties and delays on the Allied advance. Yet at the strategic level, the defense was compromised from the start by misallocated resources, divided command, Hitler's interference, and the sheer scale of Allied superiority in men and materials. The lessons of this campaign remain relevant to military planners and historians alike. No defensive system, however elaborate, can compensate for mobile reserves insufficient to counter a major breakthrough. No tactical proficiency, however impressive, can overcome strategic miscalculation, and no amount of individual courage can ultimately prevail against an enemy with overwhelming material advantages, coordinated combined arms tactics, and the initiative to apply force at the time and place of their choosing. For the German soldiers who faced the first wave of Allied landings on June 6, 1944, the experience was one of professional pride mixed with growing desperation, fighting effectively within their limitations while gradually recognizing the inevitability of defeat. Their story, told alongside that of their Allied opponents, completes our understanding of one of history's pivotal battles and reminds us that military history is ultimately human history, with all the complexity, tragedy, and occasional nobility that implies.